Uh, Good evening, everybody. And today's topic for our webinar is how to read a paper. And it'll be especially useful to you as students who have to learn to read a paper. And it's very important to know how to read a paper because we get our knowledge from papers and we have to write papers also. So, happy Diwali to everybody in advance and to Dr. Samidan sir, who is the speaker for today's session. Sir is well known to everybody, so I really don't need to introduce him, but nonetheless, sir is the Director of Critical Care at Ravindra Hospital, Hyderabad, and he's the Vice President of Indian Society of Critical Care Medicine. And most importantly, he has been a very active contributor to our webinars, and he has taken some sessions earlier also. So we thank him for all the contribution to our webinars. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. And without any further ado, I request him to start the session. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Tapesh. Thank you for giving me this opportunity yet again. It's a wonderful experience participating in this webinar. And I assure you that I will finish this well ahead of the toss between India and New Zealand in Dubai. So don't worry, we will be in time for the cricket match. I won't hold you back. So the topic for today, the topic of discussion for today is how to read a paper. And this is an important aspect of medical education as well as practice. As you would have realized in the last couple of years during the COVID pandemic, that we are drowning in information, but we are starved for knowledge. The reason is everything that is published is not the gospel truth, and the gospel truth is not always published. This is a fact we need to always remember, and that's why we need to know how to read what we read. The most important reasons why you should be reading art, all the research literature that is published in several journals is the fact that you need to differentiate between myths and facts. In the sense that, for example, ivermectin was supposed to work against COVID-19. Is it a myth or a fact? So you need to look at those kind of, nebulous hypothesis to understand whether this hypothesis can be taken to its logical conclusion. So if a hypothesis has been proposed that say interferons work in COVID or a particular molecule works in sepsis, has it translated into clinical benefit in patients who actually are your cohort, or the patient or the people whom you keep treating? Biologically, lot of interventions, lot of therapies are possible, but whether this biological possibility can result in clinical relevance, activated protein C, for example, cytokine adsorbent filters, for example, they are all biologically possible. You can actually adsorb cytokines onto a filter, but does it make any clinical relevance for using it? You need to answer this question, and to answer that, you need to read what is being published on this topic. Most importantly, change is permanent. Nothing else is permanent in life and in medical practice. So you need to change your mind. Like we were using saline about 10 years ago as the default fluid. Having understood all the publications which have come out in the literature in the last 10 years, we are now slowly beginning to go to balanced salt solutions. So we need to change our minds and improve the patient care. And if you read, you keep yourself abreast of what's happening, you will be able to teach others who are too busy to read. For example, you are a teacher, you read, you understand, you interpret, and your students who are working day in and day out, doing multiple shifts in the ICU, who don't have the time to read, can be taught by you. The gist of what you have read can be taught to your students. And all this will help you to be in the race to be a good practitioner following scientific medicine. What should you read? We are, as I said at the beginning of this talk, we are drowning in information. There are multiple such publications which are available for us to read. What you should read and why you should be reading what you are reading. You read case reports for anecdotes and rare occurrences. For example, you want to read about, say, thrombotic thrombocytopenic purpura in pregnancy. Right? You don't get guidelines on that. You don't get RCTs on that. You need to look at case reports, what others have seen and what their experiences are. Look at case series. The initial 6 months of COVID-19, we did not have any guidelines or we did not have any randomized controlled trials. So we looked at case series from China, we looked at case series from Italy, we looked at case series from the United Kingdom where there were more cases than what we had. And then we tried to understand that probably this is what we are going to do when it hits us. To generate a hypothesis, you want to test something, you need to know what's happened in the past. So what was the trend in the past? To understand that, you need to look at retrospective studies. Retrospective studies are not to be done away with. Retrospective studies will give you where the direction in which a particular disease is going to help you to form a hypothesis for carrying out further research, and that is the importance of retrospective studies. Once you understand and you want to follow without the the dead weight of what's happened over which you had no control, you tend to observe the patients over a period of time. These are observational studies to know the trends and the patterns. If I know, like for example, you know that somebody has done retrospective analysis and found that the SOFA score or the Q-SOFA score works. So I would try to apply that in the future to my patients who come to the hospital, and then see if their outcome improves, and then decide whether Q-SOFA was actually as good as what it was touted to be. For actionable conclusions, for anywhere, it is always better to go for a single center randomized controlled trial. But a single center randomized controlled trial is intrinsically associated with the preferences, the practices, and the attitudes and the general culture of that unit which has carried out the study. So this is what is called as bias, which we will discuss later in this discussion. Multi-center randomized controlled trials tries to eliminate this variability in different teams. See, my team sitting in Hyderabad may have a different ethos and philosophy to somebody who's sitting in Chennai, or somebody sitting in Gurgaon, or somebody sitting in Mumbai. If all of us combine together and do studies separately, this bias or this heterogeneity in what we are doing is eliminated, and that is the beauty of the multi-center randomized controlled trials. Several countries, several situations, you will have multiple multi-center studies. You need to collate all of them. And in certain situations, sample sizes of individual studies may not be very big. But if you combine all of these into multi-center studies, the sample size may be quite big. That is where meta-analysis comes into the picture. And this meta-analysis has to be analyzed and opined upon by experts, which is what is called as a systematic review. But there is something which the legal system expects from all of us, and that is minimum standard of care. So every individual who has taken responsibility of treating a patient is expected to deliver a standard of care. And that standard of care comes from minimum standards which have to be practiced, which are mentioned in the guidelines. You may do beyond the guidelines, but you cannot do something that is avoid doing something that is mentioned in the guidelines and say that I have delivered the optimum care. So all these are enough reasons for us to read what we are reading. So there are two types of literature which we generally encounter in our day-to-day analysis and day-to-day practice. This is primary literature and secondary literature. In primary literature, you have the original research articles, right? Somebody first studied esophageal pressure monitoring. Somebody first studied tidal volume challenge test. So these are original research articles. The last couple of years, you have seen a lot of surveys being sent out to you about DVT prophylaxis, about stress ulcer prophylaxis, about sepsis awareness, about glycemic control, about psychological reactions of healthcare workers to COVID. So these are all surveys which are primary research. There's nothing been done on this before, or this is being starting afresh on a new issue. Case reports. For example, we have just published a case report of a patient with flaccid quadriparesis with snake bite. So that's a case report. And you have conference proceedings and abstracts and correspondence and letters to the editor, which I feel is an important aspect, not being reported in the literature. I want to communicate to my colleagues, so I will write a letter to the editor. These are all primary literature. And the editor then comments on it. That's an editorial. So these are all primary literature. The secondary literatures are narrative reviews. Somebody goes through what's all been published in the last 1 year, 10 years, and summarizes that and writes a review. What you find in your critical care update, what you find in your textbook of critical care. These are all narrative reviews. There are systematic reviews, which I said is an expert opinion on a meta-analysis. Then there are book reviews, where somebody has written a textbook, and that textbook is reviewed by somebody. And there are guidelines, which takes into account lot of published data, grade them according to the standard grading of guidelines, and publish them. These are all secondary literature. So how to interpret literature is based on whether you are interpreting primary literature or you are interpreting secondary literature. So the hierarchy of evidence-based medicine, we all want to be known as practitioners of evidence-based medicine. So the hierarchy of evidence-based medicine begins in a pyramidal way with expert's opinion at the bottommost part. That means eminence-based medicine. Somebody is an expert in fluid resuscitation. Yes, you listen to him. You understand what he's trying to say. But before you extrapolate what he's trying to tell you, we should see how much of what he's saying is actually backed by published literature. That is case report and case series, cross-sectional studies and case control studies. Above this is the cohort studies. But the top three gold standards for evidence-based medicine which we accept are the randomized control trials, whether single or multi-center, an analysis of these randomized control trials called a meta-analysis, and an expert opinion along with a meta-analysis is a systematic review. So RCTs, meta-analysis, and systematic review are in the top 1/3 of the evidence-based medicine pyramid. I have left the top triangle of the evidence-based medicine pyramid empty because we don't know yet what is the gold standard for evidence-based medicine. As of now, we accept a meta-analysis as the gold standard. So how to choose what you want to read? So I've given you that you have so many types of literature, you have so many publications and so many models. So how do you read and how do you select what you want to read? So you need to be very clear what you are looking for. When I want to pick up something to read, I should be very clear in my mind what I am looking for. So am I looking for a new idea for research? So my postgraduate student, my super specialty student, or myself or my junior colleagues, we are looking to do research. I'm looking for a topic to guide me on this research. Then I will go through original research articles, randomized trials, controlled clinical trials and experimental studies, and case control studies and case reports to give me a hypothesis or an idea for research. However, like we did in COVID, like we do in scrub typhus, like we do in dengue, like septic shock and ARDS, we are always looking for guidance for treatment. If you are looking for a guidance to treatment, your best choice is to look at the reviews, systematic reviews and other reviews, narrative reviews. Look at proceedings of conferences and symposia, textbooks, and of course case series and case reports. The only problem with textbooks is they are always lagging behind in the most recent evidence. For example, somebody has published a textbook of critical care and a chapter on sepsis was written 2 years ago. In the last year, we have had publications on adrenomedulin, we have publications on capillary refill time, we had publications on several things. So that information may be missing if you are if the revised editions are lagging behind. That's the only pitfall of a textbook. But if you are an expert, you are dealing patient, you have enough guidance for treatment, but you want to keep yourself updated about the knowledge, you look at narrative reviews, systematic reviews, and meta-analysis. So that's how you decide what you want to choose to read. So once you know what you read, you understand the relevance of each part of an article. Any article has a title which contains the topic and information about the authors. For example, if I'm talking about renal replacement therapy, if I find Ronco, Bellomo, Mehta, and all these guys in the authors list, I know that it's coming from a very authentic source. If I'm looking at Gattinoni, Brochard, and I'm reading about ARDS. I know it's coming from a very trustworthy source. You have Anine and Meduri who have worked on steroids, so you know that this is coming from people who have spent 2 to 3 decades of their life in working on this topic. So you know it's very authentic source. Abstract gives you a brief overview of the article. So we will go into this in detail, but an abstract should help you to guide whether you should actually read the whole article or not. Introduction will tell you about background information and statement of the research hypothesis. Is the hypothesis actually a correct hypothesis? Is something you should decide based on the introduction. The material and methods will tell you how the study was conducted, what procedures was followed, when the analysis was done, and of course the statistical tools which were used in analyzing the data which was captured. The results will then summarize all the data of the study along with figures, tables, and graphs, followed by a discussion which will interpret this data and give you some conclusions, and which will quote all the references of sources from where the information relevant to carrying out this study was collected from. The title will attract you to the article first. So this is a kind of a marketing strategy. It should help you to decide on further reading. But if the title is very big, a highly descriptive title can sometimes be misleading. The entire object of the study can be merged or submerged in a very voluminous title. So a crisp title is something that you should be looking for in interpreting the data. So once you have seen the title and you say that, and you feel that the title has the relevant keywords which you are looking for, you look at the abstract. Read the abstract and see whether the aims and objectives are clear. And is the hypothesis for the research very well laid out? And the conclusions of the abstract, are they precise and keeping in tandem with what has been discussed in the introduction or in the aims of the study? And if this is the useful or relevant to what you are looking for, you read the entire article. This is how you decide. This is the role of an abstract. The abstract will tell you whether you should read the entire article or not, is the first point. Again, it is, as I said, is a marketing strategy to entice readers, like a test drive of a vehicle, right? But the test drive will not give you the most basic version of the vehicle or the highest version of the vehicle. They'll give you something intermediate so that you get sold to the concept and you go one step ahead or you go one step below and you still remain with the vehicle. So that is the same purpose which an abstract will convey. It's usually given to you free online, again for attracting more people. A structured abstract is always more reliable than a verbose, non-structured abstract. But the fact is, an abstract has word limit. Sometimes this could mean information limit. So you may not get all the information you are seeking in just by reading an abstract. So make it a point that you read the entire article before implementing the conclusions of an abstract, and never make a clinical change of plan or never change your practice based on the abstract without reading the entire article. The introduction will then provide you the rationale for conducting the study. It mentions existing knowledge and the gaps thereof. The introduction will tell you what is already known about the study and what you are going to prove. If the introduction says that, what is already known about the topic, but I'm only going to do this in a specific cohort of, say, Indians or a particular geographic location of India, then it may not appeal to you because we already know this from literature. It should mention the hypothesis for the current study, and the introduction should be able to answer the following questions. Those are, what was the research problem? And was there any mention of previous studies on this topic in the introduction? And what is the rationale for doing this study if you have already got information on this from other studies? And therefore, what are the aims and objectives? And what is their hypothesis? Is it going to be something that will change? That means it's an alternative hypothesis. Or is it saying that this intervention is not a change, that is a null hypothesis? So we should be able to understand this as well. When you come to the material and methods, the material and methods will give you technical details of the study, and it will include the patient population. Here, This is very important for all of us who read articles to understand the patient population. It may be a fantastic study, but they may have included patients who are generally not your cohort of patients. Suppose somebody has evaluated vitamin C in septic shock with patients with high-grade non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and shown a good result. But you cannot bring it into general septic patients and say because that study has proven it in non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, it works in sepsis, because the inclusion criteria of that study was totally different. And the treatment schedules, when was the treatment given, in what dose, for how long, and with what monitoring has to be understood for you to be extrapolating the results of this study into your clinical practice. We will come into the details of a blinding and stratification and subset analysis in the subsequent slides, so I will not dwell on this here. The inclusion and exclusion criteria should be well defined, and they will be helpful to apply the results to similar group of patients. So if a majority of the patients whom you are seeing fall into the exclusion criteria of a particular study, then that study cannot be used in your practice to change your treatment plans for the patient. And if a study has too many exclusion criteria, it becomes less applicable because it will create a very big outlier effect. Outlier effect is something that those who fit into the basic problem but get excluded because of several exclusion criteria which the authors have set in place, which means the number of people who are actually going to be benefited by that intervention is going to be a very small proportion of the patients who have the basic problem. That is the reason why we should always choose studies where a non-restrictive inclusion criteria is used so that the results of the study can be applied to a wider cohort or a wider based number of patients. The treatment schedules which are mentioned in the material and methods also should be very clearly understood. What are the timelines? How long has the treatment been carried out? And what has been the pre-trial workup? What tests have been done before the entry of this patient into the study for making him eligible for the study? And about the blinding, who is aware of the treatment, who is monitoring the patient, and who is analyzing the results. I will discuss this in a little bit detail in subsequent slides. What is the dosage of drugs administered, whether this dosage is less or more than what the standard pharmacopoeia recommends, and what you would normally prescribe in your practice. This is what is important for you to understand in the treatment schedules. And what outcome has been measured? Is that the outcome which you are looking for as well? Is that the outcome which you are seeing in your patients as well? For example, somebody is studying the dosage of colistin or polymyxin B versus critical illness polyneuropathy, right? And they don't report critical illness polyneuropathy. They speak about nephrotoxicity and other aspects, but your focus is on critical illness polyneuropathy. Then this study is not for you to make the judgment related to what your question was. The questions to be asked is, how did the researcher attempt to answer the research question? Has he grouped patients separately? How was the sampling done? Was it picked up at random or a specific subset of patients were selected? How were they grouped? As I mentioned, what were the inclusion and exclusion criteria? What procedures were followed and what variables were measured? If you are using multiple variables, then have they been correlated to the outcome independently and together? And what equipment and instruments were used for data collection? For example, the Andromeda shock trial brought in the importance of capillary refill time, but the instrument they used to measure the capillary refill time was a standard instrument which we don't have access to. So can we extrapolate the data which has been measured with a standardized device and measure it without the device and say that we will apply capillary refill time for resuscitating our patients? This is a question we need to answer. For example, then the other example is there are some units which speak about pupillary size and diameter related to raised ICP, transcranial Doppler velocities, and that pupillary size has been measured by a standard mechanical pupillometer. Are you going to extrapolate that into your practice where you don't have access to a pupillometer? That is something we need to question ourselves. And of course, ultimately, the statistical methods and the tests that were employed, were they apt for the evaluation? Then the results. What were the numbers treated? What were the baseline characteristics of the patients who are recruited into the study? And does this baseline keep in tandem with the routinely seen baseline cohort for with that problem? Results with relation to the endpoints. What endpoints have been set, primary and secondary, and are the results answering these endpoints? What was the compliance to treatment? How many patients actually completed the full treatment regimen? What was the dropout rate? How many patients withdrew consent midway into the study? This will bring into the front the concerns and apprehensions of the patients who are actually started on the intervention. What was the toxicity profile? Has it been reported? Is the toxicity more than the benefit? This is something you need to ask. And of course, we should have the gift of reading the tables and graphs, because the tables and graphs, if you learn to interpret them independently, they will tell a different story from what the material and methods and the results are talking. And this is something we need to understand. What you need to watch out for when you're reading such articles is the results which are studying the aim, and all patients who are enrolled in the study should be accounted for in the final analysis. Suppose the number of patients who was recruited is much higher, those who completed the study was much less, and those included in the analysis was much lesser than this, then the reliability of the interpretation vis-a-vis the sample size becomes questionable. And you also need to understand the results which are being projected, what is statistically significant versus what is clinically significant. Everything that is statistically significant may not be clinically significant. So that is something you need to understand. And have they applied the correct test for the correct data? For example, if you are doing a new intervention, the test required is number needed to treat and the number needed to harm. If you are using a new investigation, the area under the receiver operated characteristic, ROC curve, is something that you need to understand. So these are some things. The correct data has it been subjected to the correct test for you to get the correct answer is something you need to be asking yourself. Lot of times we find one study that is published which says that the study was negative. Within 6 months or 3 months, you will find that in a subgroup analysis, we have found this. So subgroup analysis, however, is not generally powered for the sample size calculation unless the subgroups have been identified a priori. That means before the first subject has been included in the trial. If the trial has been designed in such a way that several subgroups have been identified prior to the recruitment of the patients, then such a subgroup analysis can be relied upon. A subgroup analysis which is done subsequently after the study results have been published is not something you can rely upon for you to make an evidence-based decision. It should be only used, the results of a subgroup analysis should only be used to provide a hypothesis for subsequent studies, but it should not be a method or an indication for you to change your practice. But quite often you find that they are quoted and published, you just read them, you think that this is a possibility, but we should not change our practice solely on the basis of subgroup analysis. The questions we need to ask is, what are the key findings, and were all the subjects present in the beginning of the study accounted for at the end of the study, and are these results therefore reliable? When you look at the validity of the data, certain questions need to be answered as yes, and those questions are, was the assignment of patients to the treatments randomized or they were selective? If they were selective, then the results are not reliable. Were all patients who entered the trial properly accounted for? If it was not, then the conclusions are not reliable. Was the follow-up complete? If a number of patients were lost to follow-up, then the mortality or the primary outcome conclusion may not be reliable. And were patients analyzed in the groups to which they were randomized? What is the crossover rate? If the crossover rate from one set of patients to another is very high and the reverse is not true, then the intervention definitely is not something which is going to be successful. And blinding, I will talk about it in the subsequent slides, so we will skip that. So in discussion, you will get a summary, you will get a discussion of the results, you will get a comparison of the existing literature, and what are the caveats, what are the drawbacks of the study, for where you can apply, where you cannot apply, and therefore what are the future directions. However, no new information that was not discussed in the results study can be brought in under discussion. Whatever was presented in the result should only be part of the discussion. If a new conclusion is being presented in the discussion, then the results are not reliable. So the conclusions should compare with the results. The conclusions should draw inference from the discussion, and it should justify the aim. And again, the conclusion should not give you a new information that was not part of the aim or the one of the primary or secondary outcomes. This is all about the reliability of a study. So I will now come to the top half of the pyramid, that is the RCTs and meta-analysis, and I will take you through how you can actually pick and choose the quality of your randomized controlled trials and meta-analysis. So any statistical model, your three basic questions will be asked. The reason why we are having this program is we need to understand whether any paper that is published, any data that is published, can I trust the results? And if I trust the results, how do you understand those results? And to whom do I apply these results to? Do I apply it to all of my patients or a specific cohort of my patients? I'm sorry, the animation in this is not working, but nevertheless, let us go through this slide. You have a target population from which you take a patient sample. For example, I want to work on malaria. Obviously, I cannot get to see and recruit all the patients with malaria in my city. So I pick up the patients who come to my hospital. That actually triggers a selection bias. To overcome this selection bias, I do what is called as a randomization. So I don't pick up all the patients and put them into one group, I randomize them. So these patients who are randomized will have an intervention and an observation. The intervention would be something new which I'm trying to do, whereas the control would be the standard treatment which I would have offered to all these patients. Both these patients, this intervention group is exposed to the intervention and the control group is not exposed to the intervention. So when you are doing the intervention, the people who are delivering the intervention and monitoring the patients are aware that something new is happening to the patient. And so therefore it can result in something called as a performance bias. And to overcome this performance bias, you double blind. The investigator is blind to the intervention and the people who are monitoring the patient also are blind to the what has been going on with the patient. So both the groups, that is the intervention and the control group, are followed up over a period of time for the period of study, and you tend to lose them over a period of time, and all the patients who are exposed to the intervention may not be coming for follow-up. So that will result in what is called as an attrition bias. To overcome this attrition bias, there is something we do called as intention to treat analysis, where all the patients who are exposed to the intervention are calculated in the denominator for measuring the outcome. So this will take out the negative effects of loss of follow-up. When the patient comes for follow-up, we measure the outcomes like a Glasgow Coma Outcome Scale, a physical disability score, a mental disability score. So when you do that, you tend to have a bias, that is detection bias. This detection bias is overcome by blinding the assessor to what intervention the patient received. Was he in the intervention arm or was he in the control arm? The outcome assessor is not aware of this. This is something that is done called, this is a triple blinding, which is done to overcome a detection bias. So when you ask yourself whether my results are reliable and reproducible, a good outcome must not only be relevant to the patient, but also easy to access. Something that was very true about ECMO about a couple of years ago. And reliability of a study is affected by the reproducibility of the outcome used. So if I do an intervention which only I can do, nobody else in the city knows, right? And I publish it. Fine, it's good, but no other intensivists in the city can do it. So what is the purpose? How does the big cohort of patients benefit from it? So that is the question I need to ask myself. So the measure of reproducibility corrected for the agreement by chance is the kappa coefficient or the Cohen's kappa coefficient, which helps in assessing the quality of the measure. For example, two different people are working on a particular condition with a particular outcome. One group says the possibility of good outcome is 30% and bad outcome is 70%. That means the good outcome is 0.3 and the bad outcome is 0.7. The second group says that the good outcome is 40%, bad outcome is 60%. So 0.4 and 0.6. So the coefficient of a good outcome, the correlation of the intervention doing a good outcome is 0.4 in one group and 0.3 in one group. So you multiply them. So 0.3 into 0.4 is 0.12. Similarly, the negative outcome is 0.7 here and 0.6 there. So you multiply them, you get 0.42. 0.7 into 0.6 is 0.42. So when you want to look at the kappa coefficient and you add them, 0.12 plus 0.42, you will get 0.54. Any value that is more than 0.6 implies a good agreement, and a value of more than 0.8 will give you a very good agreement. So if the kappa coefficient is more than 0.8, 0.6 should give you some confidence in the study, and something that is more than 0.8 means that you need to give a lot of importance and weightage to this particular study. One of the important aspects of any material and methods is a primary outcome. A single primary outcome must be defined a priori, whether it is in-hospital mortality, whether it is 28-day mortality, whether it is vasopressor requirement or early liberation from mechanical ventilation. One primary endpoint must be defined a priori before the patients are recruited into the study. The study must be designed and the sample size has to be calculated to demonstrate whether the treatment has an effect or not on this primary outcome. What happens to the secondary outcomes is secondary, but the sample size, the power of the study, and the design of the study should be focusing on the primary outcome. So here the alpha level is the chance taken by the researchers, that is to make a type 1 error, that is incorrectly declaring a difference to be true because of only by chance producing the observed state of events. So this type 1 error of the alpha error is set at 0.05. That means 95% of the results are happening because of the intervention and not by chance. That is the importance of looking for the alpha value. The time point of the primary interest must also be defined. When am I looking at the point of outcome? Is it at hospital discharge, ICU discharge, 3 months after discharge, or 6 months after? This has to be, you cannot leave the timeline for measuring the primary outcome hanging. This is a bad design for a study. And the interim analysis must also be planned and defined in advance. Suppose a study has started and they did not define at what sample size, recruitment level or time frame they are going to do an interim analysis, but suddenly they realize that they need to do an interim analysis for any reason, then the value of the interim analysis does not hold weight or does not give you much information or help in guiding your therapy. The primary outcome should not be changed after interim analysis. Several studies have been published in the last couple of years where they set out with doing one particular primary outcome and then they change the primary outcome after interim analysis. That is not acceptable. And all secondary outcomes must also be recorded and reported. And that is an important part of the etiquette and the reliability of a study. Subgroup analysis. As I said before, the subgroup analysis are multiple analysis of the same data, but they incur a considerable risk of false positive findings. Subgroup analysis has a risk of high false positive rates and therefore it should always be pre-planned. You cannot do it ad hoc in the midst of a study. And the subgroup should also be adequately powered for the outcome which you have set out to do for the primary outcome. And the treatment effect interaction is the best method to validate the findings of a subgroup analysis. So the treatment effect for whatever you are doing, an intervention for dichotomous outcomes, survival or non-survival, whatever outcomes, there are two different outcomes are there. Then you look at the relative risk, the absolute risk reduction, the hazard ratios, which I will describe in a short while. And for continuous data, it means that the difference is in the means of both the groups is what will tell you the estimation of the effect of the treatment or the intervention. The p-value, which we always look for in data, is useless for assessing the size of the treatment effect. The treatment effect, the effect of an intervention, is reflected by the relative risk reduction and the number needed to treat, which we will discuss. For example, in a study of 20 patients in control and 15%, if 20% of a patients in the control arm and 15% of patients in the intervention arm have died because of an intervention, the relative risk is the number who died in the intervention by the number who died in the control, that is 15 by 25 is 0.75. A relative risk of 0.75 means that the new treatment reduced the risk of death by 25%, that is 1 minus the relative risk. The closer the relative risk is to 1, lesser is the treatment effect. For a treatment to be effective, the relative risk should be as far away from 1 as possible. So as less a value as 1 possible will tell you the better success of an intervention. And the relative risk that is expressed over a period of time, over 6 months or per year or per quarter, is the hazard ratio. So for this, getting the relative risk is the most important. Understanding the relative risk in the data presented to you is the most important aspect. Odds ratio, on the other hand, is the ratio of events, that is mortality, to non-events in the intervention group over the ratio of events to non-events in the control group. So how many in the control group died, how many in the intervention group died is one aspect. How many survived there, how many survived here, the ratio of these two will give you the odds ratio. Absolute risk reduction could be considered a better measure of treatment effect because it reflects the expected absolute benefit, taking into account the baseline risk of the patient, his background history, his Apache scores and all that. So the absolute risk reduction is the difference between the proportion of control patients who die and the proportion of treatment patients who die. For example, in the same example, if a proportion of patients who died 15% of what and 20% of what will tell you is the difference between that ratio is the absolute risk reduction. If 15% of the treatment cohort and 20% of the control cohort died, the absolute risk reduction is 5%, that is 0.05. So you know that 15% and 20%, the risk reduction is only 5%, that is absolute reduction is 0.05 or 5%. For the absolute risk reduction to be meaningful in clinical practice, the reciprocal of absolute reduction is usually used, and the reciprocal of absolute risk reduction is nothing but the number needed to treat. The number needed to treat is the number of patients who need to be treated with the intervention rather than the control for one patient to be benefited. The shorter this number, the more beneficial is the treatment. For example, if the number needed to treat with the use of a specific drug is only 5, that is a better drug than if the number needed to treat of a drug is 7. So 5 is better than 7 and 7 is better than 9 is what you can understand from the numbers needed to treat. The number needed to treat is the reciprocal of the absolute risk reduction. So if the absolute risk reduction is 5% or 0.05, the number needed to treat is 20. So in this intervention, where 15% of the cohort died, of the treatment cohort died, and 20% of the control died, 20 patients should be treated for one patient to benefit from the intervention. Suppose there is another intervention that is being done where only 16 patients have to be treated before one patient is benefited. That will be a better intervention than what we are studying. So this is the difference between the risk versus the odds. In the risk, you find that it is a part of the total cohort, whereas the odds ratio will take out the people who are actually in the affected zone from the denominator and will calculate the ratio. Those who died versus those who survived versus those who died versus those who were involved. So this is the odds ratio and this is the risk reduction and the number needed to treat. A large treatment effect, that means an intervention which is very effective in the absolute scale, leads to a small number needed to treat. The most obvious NNT is 1. That means you need to treat only one patient for something to be of benefit. We haven't found such a thing in medicine as yet. So a smaller number needed to treat is what you should be looking for if you want to change your practice. For continuous outcomes, the measurement of the treatment effect is the difference in the means between the treatment and the control group, and this will tell you this is given by the standard deviation, which reflects the dispersion of values around the mean. So average and the dispersion of the values around the average will give you the standard deviation, and that will tell you the measure of treatment effect. Dividing the difference of the means by the standard deviation will allow you to compare the effect of treatment across continuous treatment. So the mean of the treatment minus the mean of control divided by the pooled standard deviation will give you what is called as the effect size. Then we'll try to understand what is a confidence interval. Dr. Tapesh, can I continue? It may take another 20 minutes.
Not a problem, sir. All the time in the world, not a problem. If you want to just stop for 2-3 minutes, have a glass of water.
No. I'm okay, but you just have to tell me when I have to stop.
No, there is no problem with the time. Time is all yours. Still, if you can continue beyond 6, there is no problem.
Okay. So the precision of the estimation or the confidence interval is another parameter we need to understand. The true measure of the treatment effect can never be known. There may be some patients who respond to the treatment without the treatment being effective, and there may be patients who do not respond to the treatment despite the treatment being effective. So this is the true measure of the treatment effect, which can never be known. What can definitely be known is what works in 95% of the patients. That is the 95% confidence interval. The 95% confidence interval is used to estimate the neighborhood within which the true effect likely lies. That is the range that includes the true value of the effect that will likely to affect 95% of the people. For example, in an RCT that is enrolling 100 patients in each arm with a relative risk reduction of 0.75 with a confidence interval of 0.41 to 1.38, the treatment effect could be a benefit of 59% where the confidence interval is 0.41 or a harm of 38% where it is 1.38. So you can have a 59% benefit and a 38% harm. So it's a wide range of confidence interval. So the benefit of the treatment cannot be inferred if the confidence interval includes the number 1. The same RCT with a sample size of 1000 in each arm can yield a 95% confidence interval of 0.59, which means you have a 41% chance of benefit and you have a 9% chance of harm. So implying a benefit from the intervention. So confidence interval, if it has to be in favor of the intervention, has to be less than 1. If the confidence interval of a particular entity or an intervention or a procedure or a drug is on either side of 1, then the precision or the effect of this intervention is not likely to be clinically significant. The bottom line on the confidence interval is When the confidence interval of a ratio contains 1 or 0, the difference is not statistically significant and the result can be taken as no effect. So when you read the 95, when you read a particular number, always see what is the 95% confidence interval. It should always be less than 1. That is when you feel that your intervention is going to be beneficial and it should provoke you to change your practice. Now comes the celebrated p-value. Everybody wants to know what the p-value is. The p-value will shows how often the results would have occurred by chance if there was no difference between the two groups. In mathematical terms, it is the test of probability. In other words, the p-value will describe the risk of false positive conclusions of a difference when there was no difference. So the lesser the p-value, the lesser the chance that this outcome has occurred because of chance. So the p-value reflects the statistical significance of a difference, but it does not tell you how big this difference is. For example, you use an antihypertensive drug among 1 lakh patients and the blood pressure drops significant in a population in a sample where the p-value is 0.05 or 0.005. That means that definitely a particular drug will reduce the blood pressure, but how much benefit it confers over the existing treatment, you cannot make that judgment unless you know what is the number needed to treat for that drug. The p-value will only tell you, it will tells only if the observed difference is likely to be true or only the result of the chance. If the p-value is more than 0.05, what you are seeing in the statistical analysis is only a chance occurrence and not because of an effect of treatment or intervention, and statistically considered to be not significant. A p-value that is less than 0.05 means that the result would have arisen by chance in less than 1 occasion in 20, and points more than 0.05 means that the relative risk does not contain 1. But again, I would reiterate that p-value is not always a test of clinical significance. P-value is a test of statistical significance. Clinical significance is always decided by the confidence interval, the absolute risk reduction, and the number needed to treat. So that brings into question the difference between clinical significance versus statistical significance. Clinical significance addresses the size of the treatment effect, whereas statistical significance addresses the credibility of the treatment effect. Statistical significance depends on the size of the difference between the groups and on the number of the patients. If you increase the sample size, the statistical significance gets enlarged. So the p-value alone gives no information on the magnitude of the effect. So do not adopt any treatment strategy only on the presence of a significant p-value. Clinically trivial differences can be statistically significant if the sample size is sufficiently large. For example, if I am looking at, say, giving ulinastatin for patients with pancreatitis, and I find that those who are more than 6 foot 2 inches tall have a better outcome with ulinastatin, p-value may be significant. The taller patients may be doing better with ulinastatin, but how do I get it into clinical practice? It's not possible. So that all brings us to the question of sample size calculation. The sample size calculation for varied outcomes, that is dichotomous outcomes, requires 4 components. That is, as I said, the type 1 error, false positivity, the power, with what strength it can detect the change in the outcome with the intervention, how often is this the adverse event going to happen in the control group, and a minimal treatment effect of interest. So all these factors have to be factored in while calculating the sample size. The sample size is probably too small if in the calculation the clinically relevant minimal treatment effect assumed is too large. You expect the results to be very effective, or the event rate is overestimated. For example, GI bleeding in stroke who has received thrombolysis. What is the percentage? If you overestimate it, then you will never find a positive correlation, and the standard deviation is underestimated for continuous outcomes. So this is something we need to remember. when you read the results. All this will then bring you to the results. Applicability of the results. Can I trust the results is one point versus can I put them into practice is another question. So you should know the setting of the trial. Has it been done in the kind of setup which you are working? Suppose I'm working in a rural setup and I find I'm reading a study which is done, say, in Medanta Institute. Then the results, the equipment, the infrastructure available in that setup is not accessible to me. So I can't put them into my practice. Selection of patients are the patients who have been enrolled into that study very similar to what I am saying is what I need to understand. What are the characteristics of the randomized patients? What is the difference between the trial protocol and routine practice? Does the trial protocol mandate a complete change of my treatment policies? What are the outcome measures? Do I see those outcomes in my patients and follow up? And what is the adverse effect of treatment? Does the adverse effect justify the benefit? This is some questions we need to ask before we make the results applicable. So you have a patient dilemma, you ask your questions, you acquire your data, you apprise the hierarchy of evidence, and then you apply. And then you assess the outcomes. We can get variable outcomes for your patients because evidence alone does not decide. You need to combine with other knowledge and values. Whatever is evidence-based may not be effective in all kinds of patients. So the last aspect, in the next 5 minutes or 10 minutes, I will complete. What is a meta-analysis? A meta-analysis is the synthesis of all the available evidence relating to a particular therapeutic question in a disease area. Corticosteroids in COVID or corticosteroids in meningitis. The disease area is meningitis. Therapeutic question is corticosteroids. So you get all the data that is available for these two questions, for the question and the outcome, and then you analyze the data that is available. Whenever more than one trial has investigated the same or similar therapy in a particular disease, a systematic meta-analysis can provide the clearest picture of the totality of the evidence or the reliability of the evidence or the extrapolation of the results. Even when large and relatively reliable trials have been performed, a meta-analysis can still provide the most definitive evidence available. And by combining the sample sizes of all the studies that are available, the overall sample size is increased. Therefore, the statistical power as well as the precision of the estimate of treatment, your NNT, for example, your ARR, for example, become more reliable if all the data can be pooled into a meta-analysis. Commonly, we hear about systematic reviews versus meta-analysis. I think there's already a question by Dr. Atul who has asked me the difference between narrative review and a systematic review. A systematic review is a type of review which answers a focused research question which may or may not include a meta-analysis. Whereas a narrative review is just a gathering of all the randomized controlled trials and all the evidence, including observational studies, and then putting them into a narrative review. When systematic reviews contain a statistical synthesis of the included studies to generate a single number called the effect size, this becomes a meta-analysis. And meta-analysis refers to that portion of the systematic review that involves the statistical analysis. So meta-analysis is a part of a systematic review, but it is not the whole systematic review per se. The steps in a meta-analysis are you have a research question like transfusion triggers in trauma. That's a research question. So you write the protocol, you register in the CTRI, you identify all the studies which are using, which include all the inclusion and exclusion criteria which you have in mind, and develop a comprehensive search strategy. And you select the right studies which will stick to your transfusion triggers, the duration of the sickness of the patients, and the inclusion and exclusion criteria which you want to have in your mind based on the protocol which you have decided. Based on that, you select all the randomized control trials which have studied the question which you have in mind. You assess the quality of these studies and then analyze them by putting them into a forest plot. I will show you what a forest plot is. So for formulating the research question, you follow the Picot hypothesis, that is, what is the problem, what intervention are you studying, who are the controls, what is the outcome of your interest, and what is the time frame for getting the outcome of your interest. Then you look at the expectation. Who is the client group? Am I targeting doctors? Am I targeting AMBOs? Am I targeting nurses? In what location? And what is the impact it is expected to have? So, what is the sample size? What is the phenomenon I'm going to study? And what is the design? All this have to be homogeneous across the studies. And in the same setting, perspective, with the same intervention, and with the comparison evaluation which you have in mind. So this will limit the number of studies. Suppose I find 1,000 studies at the end of my application of the selection process, I will be left with 10 or 15 studies which will help me, which will fit into my inclusion criteria. So understanding what the effect size is very important for understanding a meta-analysis. It represents the basic unit of a meta-analysis. When two interventions A and B are compared, the effect size is the difference between A and B and the size or magnitude of this difference. So the effect size is a standard metric that expresses the difference between two groups, usually the experimental group and the control group. And it can be, as I mentioned, as the standard mean difference for continuous variables, or odds ratio, or the risk ratio. So the odds ratio of all the studies and the risk ratio in all the studies you have selected should be comparable or similar. The weights of the studies which are being included, each study that is added to a meta-analysis carries its weight. This is driven by two key factors. The sample size of the study is the one that contributes a big weightage to the study. The bigger studies have a higher weightage, and this may be one of the flip sides of the meta-analysis, that the larger studies tend to swing the meta-analysis in their favor. And what are the outcomes in each study? The more the outcomes which are studied, the better it is for a meta-analysis to be carried out. Then there is something called as the fixed effect model and the random effect model. In the fixed effects model, it is assumed that the effect size in all included studies is identical. Suppose I have identified 15 studies for a meta-analysis. The effect size, that is absolute risk reduction or the odds ratio, is the same in all the studies. And any difference between them is a result of the differing sample sizes and the associated variability, not by the treatment effect. The studies with a smaller sample size will get a lower weight, and the larger studies will get a higher weight. So that is the fixed effect model. In the random effect model, it is assumed that each study is unique, and therefore each study will have its own effect size. The random effects model is based on the assumption that if a large number of studies for the same research questions using the preset criteria, the true effect size could be distributed around a mean. So these are all heterogeneous studies. There is a mean, and they're all distributed around this mean. So this heterogeneity has to be tested. The extent of heterogeneity will significantly impact the conclusions of a meta-analysis, because if you are comparing apples and oranges, obviously you will get different results. So the two statistical tests are used to address this: the Cochrane's Q test, or what is called as the Q test, and the I-square test. These two tests are used for the heterogeneity. The I-square test describes heterogeneity as a percentage. For example, if the I-square, which is mentioned at the bottom of a meta-analysis, I will show you, is 50%, it means that 50% of the variation across the results is a result of heterogeneity and not chance. So the results of this meta-analysis can vary. If you interpret them into your patient practice, 50% of the time you may be right, 50% of the time you may be wrong. So the majority of the focus or the results of a meta-analysis are published in what is called as the forest plot. The forest plot will tell you all the studies which have been included in the meta-analysis, which have been selected after a rigorous selection process. The column 2 will tell you the 2 interventions which are used, and the sample sizes of all the studies which have studied both the interventions, and the weight which each of the study has been accorded to using the random effect model. And then you will get the odds ratio. So we discussed about the importance of the odds ratio. So what is the odds ratio of one intervention affecting the outcome is represented in the overall odds ratio. And you find an I-square and the heterogeneity test of I-square of 60%. So you are probably looking at a very heterogeneous group of studies in this meta-analysis. So you will find the odds ratio in the center and the deviation or the confidence intervals on either side of the odds ratio in the forest plot. Sorry, I pressed the wrong button. So the confidence interval in the forest plot, if the center is the odds ratio, the point estimate is the square that is at the either side of the straight line, whereas the 95% confidence interval is reflected by the length of this line which is on either side of the point estimate. Or if you have a rhomboid which is representing the point estimate, the ends of the rhomboid will describe the confidence interval. So we understood the 95% confidence interval. A wider the confidence interval, the more heterogeneous the data, the more difficult it is to extrapolate the results. So as I said, heterogeneity is defined by both the I-square test and the degree of freedom, or the degree of to understand the heterogeneity. You also do the X-square test. The degree of freedom is equal to the number of trials in the meta-analysis minus 1, and the X-square is similar to the degree of freedom. If the X-square and the degree of freedom are similar, then there is no heterogeneity. If the I-squared which can vary from 0 to 100%, if it is less than 25%, it is non-heterogeneous. If it is more than 25%, it is seriously heterogeneous. For example, in this study, the I-square is 67.9%, which means several heterogeneous studies have been included, and therefore the results have to be interpreted with caution. The last thing about meta-analysis is that you have to look at the funnel plot. The funnel plot will tell you how different heterogeneity, how significantly heterogeneous the study results are of all the studies which have been included in your meta-analysis. The funnel plot is a scatter plot of individual studies with their precision and their results, with each dot in the funnel. I'll go back one slide. Each dot in the funnel will represent one study, and each study has its own precision and its own results. The y-axis is usually the standard error of the estimate, of the effect estimate, and larger studies with the higher power are placed towards the larger studies with higher sample sizes are placed towards the top of the y-axis. So the study results, the higher ones are on the y-axis, and they tend to determine the outcomes of the meta-analysis more. And the lower powered studies are placed towards the bottom of the funnel. The x-axis will show the results for the study, sometimes expressed as the odds ratio. The funnel plot should ideally resemble a pyramid or an inverted funnel with scatter due to sampling variation. So, if you imagine this picture without the triangle, all these dots are in a triangular form or an inverted funnel. So if they are skewed, they become trapezoid or they become rhomboid, then the shape of this funnel plot is not going to be encouraging for you to interpret the meta-analysis. The shape is expected because the studies will have a wide range of standard errors, so they will go up and down, but they all should be have a common focus, that is the outcome of interest. If the standard errors were the same size, then the studies would all fall on a horizontal line, and that is ideal, but is not usually possible in medical literature. An asymmetrical funnel plot would mean, first of all, poor methodological design of the analysis, including fraud or inadequate analysis. And it could also mean a reporting bias, including delayed publication and location bias, or selective reporting of the outcomes and selective analysis of the reporting of the analysis. And it could mean chance. 95% of the studies will usually fall within the triangular region if there are no biases or heterogeneity is present in the studies. And if heterogeneity results in a correlation between study size and intervention effect, then it's not a study you need to be giving too much attention to. So an asymmetrical funnel plot is a red light for you for analyzing and accepting the results of a meta-analysis. The problem with meta-analysis is, on a particular topic, if you find that this outer gray zone is all the studies which are conducted, only a fraction of them are published. So the meta-analysis is only going to sample them, a part of this and a part of that. So it's always going to be a limited representation of published data. So the criticism, although meta-analysis is considered as a gold standard for evidence-based medicine, there are a little bit of criticism. That's why I left the top triangle of the pyramid open. A single number cannot justify findings of multiple RCTs. That's the question. That's the point. Publication bias. Some of the good studies may not be published in the journals which you have selected. It's like, as I said, apples and oranges problem. You need to mix and match, but at the same time find a common outcome of interest. Then there is this GIGO problem, that is garbage in, garbage out. That means if you select garbage and put it into a processor, what comes out is still garbage. So if you take bad studies, put them into meta-analysis, your meta-analysis will be equally or if not even worse. And you may ignore key studies by overlook in your search of literature because of observer errors. So heterogeneity of studies will address the problem of single number. The funnel plot is mandatory to address the problem of funnel publication bias. And you should see all studies as fruits, not as apples and oranges. You need to be very attentive to the selection criteria. And if the observer commits error, change the operator. The problem is with the operator, not with the meta-analysis. So ultimately, I can say that understanding statistics is very exciting, but it's something that has to be done reasonably. For example, if a village was founded in 1802 at an altitude of 620 feet above sea level and has a population of 3,700, you can't sum up all of them and say 6,122. The number doesn't make any sense. Okay, so that's how you should interpret statistics. So in conclusion, I can say let us read with method and propose to ourselves an end to which our studies may point. So the use of reading is to aid us in thinking, a statement made by Edward Gibbon, and particularly relevant in this era when we are inundated with information but are deprived of knowledge. If you want to read more, if you want to understand more, I can suggest two very good books on medical statistics for you, all of you. How to Read a Paper by Trisha Greenhoff, which is a landmark book, very simple to read and very, very informative. So also the fourth edition of this Medical Statistics Made Easy by Mark Harris is also available. Both are very, very good, even for a doctor. It's very good to understand and very simple to understand. Thank you very much for sparing your time, and I think we can now discuss. Dr. Tapesh.
Thank you, Dr. Saminan, for the excellent talk, very informative and lovely slides, and I think that was very clear. The audience must have appreciated that. Now, if there are any questions, please answer that. Sir has already answered Dr. Atul's question, and he has said thank you. Friends, just like to share a couple of things. He has given you the scientific part of how to read a paper. But my experience, as I grew up, the problem apart from learning how to read a paper, which of course comes with time as you are a student, was that what papers to read here. It's a crazy world of publication. Everybody wants to publish because that is the way upwards. And it is well known that a lot of publications are incorrect information, and It has even been stated by a past editor of Enigem. Enigem is the most respected journal in medicine, that she herself started doubting the authenticity of the original research article sent to Enigem. So, in this crazy world, how do we decide what papers to read? Right? You hit the internet with a particular topic. Let's say mechanical power, one of the new things, and you want the internet shows up a lot of papers. You find some of them interesting. Let's say 10 papers you think are interesting. Now, which are authentic, right? So I will try to give you names of certain experts. These are leading experts. There are many experts. Of course, I cannot share all the names, but I'll just help you with choosing papers by these experts. They're authentic and they give you very cost-effective information. So we'll start with mechanical ventilation, which defines our specialty, right? Critical care is mechanical ventilation. The rest of the things come in from all the other specialties. So, sir had mentioned Professor Garinoni, mechanical ventilation and ARDS. And amongst others, for pulmonary critical care, you have Dr. Guerin, who gave us the PROSIVA trial, Dr. Fratt, who gave us the high flow trial. Then we have Dr. Brochard, who is very good with NIV. Then, of course, we have Dr. J.L. Vincent for sepsis. For hemodynamics, we have Professor Pinsky, Michael Pinsky, De Becker, and Dr. Tibor. And for liver, Dr. Julia Winden. For nephrology, Dr. Bellomo, he's from Australia. And then Dr. Romko. For neurocritical care, we have Dr. Citerio, and of course there are others. And for fluids, we have Dr. Monet. So these are some of the experts who give you very cost-effective, very nice information, and they are the leading experts. Of course, there are many other experts, but these are some of the names I can give you. And of course, I cannot give you all the names. So authenticity is very important, because it's horrible that you read a paper and then you realize you have read wrong information. So it just goes down the alley, the wrong alley. So that is something I wanted to share with you. And if you have any questions, there are no more questions, I think. Then I think we shall close the session. And those of you who want to watch the match, it's going to be a very tight match, I think. So let's hope we win, because otherwise we are not going to reach the semis. Okay, so it's going to be very tough the way the Pakistanis are playing and England is playing. I think it's going to be very difficult for India this time. Okay, guys, thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Thank you. Happy Diwali to everybody.
Happy Diwali.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
The link may change next time. Okay, we may switch to Zoom. So, guys, please check the link. This link may not be the same. It's going to change either next week or the week after that. And sir's recording will be up on our YouTube channel. For those of who you may not know, this will be on YouTube in a couple of days. So you can revise it and go through it. Thank you, sir. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Thank you, Sipla. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.